Welcome to the recorded version of Understanding the Scam Seniors Face, part of the Family Caregiver Support webinar series brought to you by the American Society on Aging and a generous sponsorship from Home Instead Senior Care.
Our presenter today is Dr. Amy Dupree. Dr. Dupree, a gerontological social worker, is an internationally renowned expert on lifestyle issues relating to caregiving, retirement, aging, and family dynamics. Dr. Dupree is president of Essential Conversations, Inc. and Dr. Amy, Inc., a company dedicated to family caregiver wellness. She holds a Ph.D. and Master's in Social Work, specializing in gerontology, and earned her CSA, a designation for which she also trains others as part of their accreditation. Dr. Amy Dupree is a much sought-after speaker at corporate and professional events on the topics of caregiving, aging, and retirement, and she's also a frequent guest on radio and television. And with that, I'd like to welcome our presenter, Dr. Amy Dupree. Welcome back, Amy.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here. And today we're talking about a difficult topic, talking about fraud and abuse, and really we're going to focus in widely on financial abuse of older adults. And I'm sure all of us have heard the stories, whether it's about a neighbor of ours who is a vulnerable older adult, and they've been taken for cash on projects that were never finished, by handymen, that sort of thing, or that were completed but not done well, or a call for a donation that goes to some non-existent charitable group, or even internet or email scams that have ongoing charges for products and services that are never delivered. And sometimes, I'm sure we've all heard stories about crimes that involve violence and even loss of life. So what we want to do today is we want to look at the different types of abuse. And we're also going to talk about who gets victimized, who the typical perpetrators are, and what some of the signs are that something may not be right. Because what we want to do, obviously, is try to stop this as much as possible and intervene as early as possible. So we also want to talk about, what conditions act as enablers that put people more vulnerable for the abuse and fraud. And again, the overall theme we want to have by the end is what can we do to help protect older adults in our society from becoming victims. Both what can we do as professionals and what can we do with just the people that we love in our lives to try to prevent this. So let's talk about the different types of fraud and abuse. And when we talk about this, I want you to know that we're basing a lot of the information today on a 2011 study that found that financial abuse of older adults falls into three types of crimes. And you see these listed on the screen: crimes of occasion or opportunity, crimes of desperation, and crimes of predation. So a little background on the study so you know where it comes from. In 2009, the MetLife Mature Market Institute, who I'm sure you know does fabulous research, they worked in collaboration with the National Committee for the Prevention of Elder Abuse and with the Center for Gerontology at Virginia Tech. And they released a study on the extent and implications of elder financial abuse called Broken Trust, Elders, Family, and Finances. And what this study did was it consisted of a review of the scholarly and professional literature, as well as an in-depth analysis of newsfeed articles from April through June in 2008. And it was designed to provide easily accessible and well-researched information specifically focused on this topic of older adult financial abuse. In 2010, to further examine the impact of this topic, MetLife Mature Market Institute once again partnered with the researchers at Virginia Tech and the University of Kentucky in consultation with the National Committee for the Prevention of Elder Abuse. And that research team expanded its analysis of research published in the scholarly literature and gathered additional articles from the U.S. Administration on Aging National Center on Elder Abuse newsfeed. So this is really fabulous information we're drawing from today. It's they're great sources. And if at the end any of you need the sources again, I'm happy to give you that because that's what we're going to base what we're talking about on today. Okay, so looking at those three things you see on your screen, let's just talk about them a little bit. Crimes of occasion or opportunity are incidents of financial abuse that occur because the victim is, you could say, almost in the way of what the perpetrator wants. And that's usually money or assets of some type. When we talk about crimes of desperation, as you can guess, these are typically those in which family members or friends get so desperate for money that they'll do whatever it takes to get it. And many of these family members are dependent on the older relative for either housing or money. And then the third type of crime, the crimes of predation, occur when trust is developed for the specific purpose of financial abuse. And we're going to talk about each of these in detail, and I'm going to give you some examples of actual cases that have occurred so that we have a better sense of what to look for when we're talking to older adults. So let's start by focusing in on crimes of occasion. Now, as I said, the crimes of occasion or opportunity are instances of financial abuse or exploitation that occur because the victim is merely in the way of what the perpetrator wants. So in this case, the older adult has money, assets, or things like that, and the occasion presents itself for the perpetrator to take the resource. So let me give you an example of this. It was mentioned in the MetLife study, and it involved a Manhattan businessman who was charged with grand larceny, forgery, and other charges after he stole over $330,000 from a 98-year-old semi-retired lawyer. So the perpetrator invited the victim, let's call him Hal, to use his office space. He was 98 and he was still working, so he needed office space. And when this older adult, Hal, broke his hip, that's when the abuse began. And what the perpetrator did was he had access to Hal's financial information, and of course Hal's absence provided the perfect opportunity for the perpetrator to dig in and help himself to Hal's assets. Now, it's often not that much money. So let's talk about another example that doesn't involve that much cash. And this one involves an 83-year-old woman, Allison, and the perpetrator in this case was her handyman. And, you know, these handyman situations are quite common, which is too bad because, as we all know, there's lots of people who are providing handyman services who are completely honest. But in this case, this was a situation where he took advantage of Allison because she was living on her own. She actually had less than $900 per month that she was living on, and she was receiving benefits from both Medicare and Medicaid. What she did is she typically kept the door to her house open, and she kept money in her purse. And she had previously helped the perpetrator with gas money, and she'd also helped him with paying for a party after a funeral. And because she had done that for him, he knew that she kept cash in her purse, and he helped himself to her money when she was out of the house. So the opportunity was the unlocked door and also his knowledge that there was always money in the purse. Now, she reported the theft, and she reported, the perpetrator, and found out in doing that he'd also stolen from other older adults as well. And eventually he ended up going to jail. So that was a case where the perpetrator actually was arrested and was punished for it. Okay, so let's now talk about some common scams and things that people need to watch out for in regards to scams. As you know, there's lots of common scams that fit in this category of abuse. First of all is health care or health insurance fraud. And what these schemes tend to do is focus on offers of free or often unnecessary medical equipment and tests that the seniors or health insurance are later being charged for, but they're never being delivered. So, as you can imagine in this population where seniors are needing a lot of health support often, it's easy to perpetrate this kind of crime because people are vulnerable by the very nature of their medical conditions. So the second is being offered and sold counterfeit prescription drugs. So again, in this age where people often are struggling to be able to afford their drugs, this becomes a crime that is easy to hit older adults with who often are taking very expensive drugs. The third is funeral and cemetery fraud, where the funds are taken in advance and the cemetery doesn't exist or the funeral home doesn't exist. And again, what's unfortunate about this one is there are many funeral homes and cemeteries that are completely legitimate that are doing upfront payment, and these folks who are doing the scams are playing on people not recognizing that sometimes they're not honest. Fourth thing are for fraudulent anti-aging products. And when we talk about anti-aging products, we know that many people are really very interested in trying to prevent or reverse the aging process. And so playing on that desire is a scam that's pretty common. Another one is telemarketing fraud. And telemarketing fraud is especially targeting older women who live alone. Now, in general, those scams involve things like either a free prize or a sweepstakes or low-cost vitamins and healthcare products, or it might be an inexpensive vacation that requires an immediate response. And often all of these things require some form of prepayment or some handling cost that's very high, and again, none of which is legitimate. There's also telemarketing fraud that includes donation requests for fake charities. That's a pretty common one. There's also telephone frauds where people are contacted either by telephone or internet for this one about, I'm a friend of your grandchild, and they're stuck in such and such a place and need your help. There are those kind of scams as well. On internet fraud, it can include non-delivery of items ordered online, credit card scams, debit card scams, and I am often shocked by how sophisticated these scams are. We tend to think of the next one when we think about that, which are kind of the Nigerian letter fraud that we get on the internet. But there are a lot of internet scams that are very, very sophisticated. But there is this financial exploitation that does include the investment schemes such as advance fees, prime bank notes, pyramid schemes, Ponzi schemes, Nigerian letter fraud. There are also financial schemes that sometimes include reverse mortgage scams where seniors are offered either something like a free home or an investment opportunity and foreclosure and financial assistance. So again, when you think about those, often they're competing with the very legitimate services. And then the eighth one we see in the top of your screen, which is identity theft. And this, of course, is becoming more and more common. And that's when an older adult gets a call or a letter or an email asking for account verification information. And it includes things such as their Social Security number and accounts. And then the scammers use this information to open credit cards, loans, lines of credit, to purchase goods and services that are billed to the older adult. So those are all pretty common and are going on now. And as you know, these change once people get onto one and there's a recognition that this is likely a scam, a new one pops up. So let's now talk about crimes of desperation, because this is the second of those three areas we mentioned. I think this is what a lot of us will think about besides the scams when we think about what happens to older adults. And this is really typical of something a family member or a friend does because they're so desperate for money that they'll do whatever it takes. And I think what's also key here is there's often a dependency issue where the family member is dependent on the older adult for housing and or money. A lot of times there's a drug or alcohol dependency that plays into this crime. So let me give you a couple of examples here and what can happen. So here's one example from the study. This is when the victims, so the older adult's daughter and son-in-law, faked a hostage taking to get the money. So what they did was the son-in-law called the older adult and said that a man had taken his wife, and his wife was the daughter of this person. He said the kidnappers were going to shoot the wife unless they gave him $425. That's all he was asking for, $425. Well, in this case, the older adult agreed to meet her son-in-law with the money. But she was pretty smart cookie because she also called the police, and they picked up the son-in-law just after he'd taken the money. The daughter, who was supposedly this hostage taken, was waiting at a nearby gas station, and according to the police, they were on their way to go spend the money on drugs. I actually know of a family who's recently been a victim of this kind of crime, this crime of desperation, and this was a family where the son had an ongoing drug abuse issue, and throughout his life he'd been in and out of treatment centers, and at this point he was living with his aging parents, both of whom needed extensive care, and he was they named him on their bank accounts as they added him on so they made the bank accounts joint, and then where most of the money was, he had access through their debit card. And unbeknownst to them, he was draining all of the bank accounts for drugs. And when one of the two of them died and the other one needed care, the money that they had set aside for their care was not there anymore because the son had spent it, which meant that they had to make care choices they would not have made. So again, a horrible situation and something that just happened recently that I know about. Now, when we talk about these cases of crimes of desperation, sometimes it is the desperation, and then sometimes, as you can see on there, and this isn't either or, it can be the sense of entitlement. So this is when the family member, the one who's exploiting, comes to believe that they deserve the money or they deserve the possessions, either because they're providing care for the older person, and it doesn't really matter how much or how much little they're giving, or because of past events in their lives. You know, you owe me this because you paid for everything for my sister and nothing for me, and therefore I'm just taking what's already due to me, this sense of entitlement. In the case of the entitlement and in desperation, it's often a repeating pattern of theft, which is, again, another reason it's very sad because it's not just a one-time situation. Okay, so let's talk about the third area now, which are crimes of predation. When we talk about crimes of predation or occupation, they occur when a perpetrator takes steps to gain the victim's trust for the sole purpose, really, of stealing from them. So sometimes trust is built in a romantic relationship. This is kind of a classic situation. And sometimes there's trust because the perpetrator is occupying a role that involves trust. So we immediately probably think of a situation of a young gold digger falling in love with an older person in order to get a hold of their assets. And this is a very tough situation for not just the older person, but for family members a lot of times to sort out. Because, of course, not everyone is behaving that way. Some people truly just are in love and are not going after the money. The MetLife study cites the example of a con artist who pleaded guilty to stealing more than $100,000 from two disabled older men. And in 2008, the perpetrator married one of her victims, a 64-year-old man named Howard, who unfortunately suffered from mental and physical handicaps. The motive wasn't love, it was larceny in this case. And she ended up stealing more than $50,000 from his bank accounts. The 29-year-old perpetrator also cashed checks worth $60,000 from another person who was a 90-year-old person with dementia, and that was a year later. So, you know, her scam was to find these vulnerable people and then to prey on this vulnerability. In another example, a court-appointed guardian, who we'll call Marie, was, another example involving a court-appointed guardian, took money from this woman that we're going to call Marie, and this is money that should have lasted a lifetime. She had a lot of money, and the guardian, who also owned a guardianship company, so this is an interesting situation. They started a guardianship company, obviously for the purpose of bilking people out of their money, and then they set it up so that they were providing Marie's personal care. And in doing this, they not only were collecting the guardianship fees, but they were also getting up to $15,000 a month in companion care fees, too. Once they take all her money, the company withdrew as her guardian. So they ended up spending all of her money and then disappearing. So when you hear of these are horrible situations and often playing on people who are vulnerable and in need of not just care, but often love, some emotional connection. And that's what people are really playing on is that situation. Let's talk about the impact and the cost of these. So in the MetLife study, the researchers calculate that the annual dollar amount lost by victims of elder financial abuse in 2010 was $2.9 billion. Isn't that amazing when you see that figure? And look, that it's an increase from 2008. Now, I think what's interesting about that is when we look at that time period from 2008 to past 2010, when this study was occurring, where was a time in our country where there was a lot of financial vulnerability. So I'm not surprised to see that figure go up. I think it would be interesting to see what happened as the economy improved. Do we still see that figure going up, or is that partly the desperation that we're seeing there? Now, when we consider the story of Marie, the woman I just told you about who had the guardianship company steal all her money, which, by the way, was over $1 million, that Marie now depends on government assistance. So there's another set of costs, and that's to us as taxpayers when people are deprived of their assets. So here this woman, Marie, had plenty of money to last the rest of her life, and now she's on government support because of this sort of scam. So I think there are so many levels which we can care about this. We can care about this because we care about vulnerable older people or vulnerable people, and we want to protect them. And then just as citizens of this country, we can care because these things are expensive, these scams. Okay, so now let's talk about another way to look at the impact and the cost, too. You can see here it's not all just financial. Obviously, there's financial loss, but there's also other costs that you can't even measure in hard dollars. And Steve, can you flip to that next slide for us, please? I'm talking about loss of trust, greater fear and suspicion, less willingness to act generously. You can see how this would all happen based on the fact that someone is built out of their money, that they suddenly become very suspicious of legitimate situations. There just are costs when you think about well-being and peace of mind. And obviously that has a spillover cost into our society too. At the same time, we know that the literature and the popular press is full of stories where financial abuse and the associated psychological impacts were really just the start of the story. We also have cases where people are dehumanized, they're abused physically, and sometimes they even lose their lives. So as hard as these are to talk about, I do want to share with you a couple of these stories because I was shocked actually about the number of these cases there are. So let's take a look at the next slide where we talk about financial abuse leading to physical abuse. And you see a couple of cases here on your slide. So we have a case of two elderly women who were beaten to death with a crowbar by their trusted handyman. And then he took and pawned all of their valuables. And I think the key there, again, is it was a trusted handyman. And then you have a situation where a 74-year-old man was stomped to death during a home invasion burglary. And then there was a woman who was exploited for Social Security checks by a live-in caregiving couple. She was neglected so severely that she was malnourished. She weighed 80 pounds at the end of this. She had bed sores that were infested with maggots and gangrene in both feet, and she ended up losing both the feet to amputation after the abuse was finally discovered. I mean, that's a situation that's so horrible, it's almost impossible to imagine it. And then there was a 65-year-old woman who suffered from dementia, and she was locked in a closet for months by three acquaintances who lived off her money during that time. Again, almost an unthinkable situation. And we have a couple more on the next slide. There was a situation of a son, and actually this is a son with his two friends who extorted money from his dying adoptive mother by threatening to burn down her home and throw her dog against a wall. And then there was a caregiving son who lived in the home of his 82-year-old mother, and he cashed her Social Security checks while she was sitting in dirty diapers with rotting food caked in her hair, and her body was covered in bed sores. And again, unthinkable situations. And then two nursing home operators, as you see in your last bullet there, who left 300 residents without basic necessities, and they were attempting to defraud Medicare and Medicaid programs of over $30 million while they let these people suffer. Obviously, these cases are nearly unthinkable and have to be stopped. They're the worst of the worst. Let's talk about who the perpetrators are of all of these types of crimes. Probably not surprising that in the MetLife study, nearly 60% of perpetrators were males. And I say not surprising, not because men are more likely to commit crimes than women, but that some of these crimes are situations where men would be able to better gain trust, like around the handyman situation and things like that. When we talk about the male perpetrators you see on your screen, they tend to be between 30 to 59 years of age, women between 30 to 49 years of age. And I think the interesting thing in the MetLife study that the perpetrators were more likely to be strangers in these studies. And they often targeted victims with visible vulnerability. So we're talking about things like limited mobility or people who clearly are displaying signs of confusion or dementia, or they live alone. I think the reason I say surprising to many of us that it's 51% strangers is because many of us know studies that find that family and friends are the most common perpetrators, and actually the MetLife research does cite earlier studies that did show that it was more likely to be friends and family. But you see here, this is the second most common group. 34% of the cases were either family, friends, or neighbors. And if you look at why, in this case, it's stranger is higher than friends, one possibility is that it is actually higher. Another is that stranger fraud is something that people are more comfortable reporting, and they're more comfortable publicizing it than fraud from family, friends, or neighbors. Because as you can imagine, there's a great deal of shame, embarrassment, and a lot of times fear of retaliation or further harm if people report elder abuse by loved ones or trusted friends and neighbors. Also on there, you can see that the business sector, there was 12% occurred within that sector, and 4% was Medicare and Medicaid fraud, or attempted Medicare and Medicaid fraud. So that gives us a picture of who is committing these crimes. Let's talk for a couple of minutes about who the victims are. So when we look at the victims of the crime, in the MetLife study and many other earlier studies, women were nearly twice as likely to be victims of elder abuse as men. Most victims, as you can see there, are between the ages of 80 and 89. And I think this is an interesting age range when we look at this, because we know that as people get into their 80s, they're more likely to have some of these visible vulnerabilities, whether it's confusion or mobility issues. And I think as our population ages and ages in a more healthy way, we'll actually see that age potentially go up. So most of them required some level of help with either their own health care or with home maintenance, as you see there. Now, this last point is very interesting because you see it's a combination of independence and observed vulnerability. And what this means is that the independence factor in this case was that in almost all the cases, the person who was the victim had a very tenuous sense of independence, but they really valued their independence. So the perpetrator was able to play on this fact that the person so desperately wanted to stay independent, and they would offer potential solutions that would allow them to stay more independent. And, of course, those solutions were fraudulent. So I think that's a very interesting combination when you think about this, that someone who is fighting for their independence yet likely has an observable vulnerability. And those things merge, and they optimize opportunities for abuse by every type of perpetrator, from closest family member to a professional criminal, because they're recognized as being in a position of vulnerability. Okay. Let's take a look at factors that can really increase the risk of being victimized. And I think you won't be surprised when you see that isolation is one of the key factors. And by the way, a number of national organizations and law enforcement agencies list these similar conditions and factors. So I think it's things that we really want to be aware of when we're working with older adults, is when we see these. So isolation is one thing. Obviously, now we're talking about some of the visible vulnerability when we talk about physical or mental disabilities. Also, though, difficulties dealing with financial matters. This can make someone at risk. And you can see that if one person in the couple dies, and in this cohort, more likely it would be the man who might have been handling money and the wife not as likely to. That will, of course, change as the boomers age, that there'll be a little bit less of that division of labor being so clear. But this puts people at risk. If the woman's never dealt with money before and now suddenly is having to manage it, and this is often a situation where she's then vulnerable to both professionals and to family members. Loneliness, because it sets people up for that emotional vulnerability in this case. Having a family member who's unemployed or has a substance abuse problem, obviously this is an issue because then you have more opportunity and more of the crime of desperation on the part of the perpetrator. And then loss is a big issue. So again, the grief that goes along with loss can put people at risk for these kind of vulnerabilities that then set them up. Let's take a look at other characteristics that can increase this risk. These are things that we may not think about as creating risk, but they do create risk. So the very fact that older adults are more likely to have a savings account, own their home, and have excellent credit puts them at risk, because it means if somebody can get their information, they're more likely to be able to utilize it to get the things that they want, knowing that this person has great credit and has access to money. Similarly, the fact that older adults are polite and trusting can put them at risk. And this is, by the way, a cohort effect, not an aging effect typically. So one of the things we know about, and think about the 80 to 89-year-old group, which is the group right now that we know is most likely to suffer these kind of crimes, that cohort grew up in a different era and has a different relationship to technology, to business. You know, as we see baby boomers age into that group, they're not necessarily going to become as vulnerable as the current older adults. That's why I say it's a cohort effect. So it affects that cohort now, but it's not something that as boomers age into, once they get to be that age, they won't be vulnerable for these reasons. They may be vulnerable because they're isolated and because they have visible disabilities and those sort of issues, but not so much on this. The fact that older adults are less likely to report fraud is an issue too, and you can see why that would be, because people know they can get away with it more. The FBI says that older Americans are less likely to report fraud because they don't know who to report to, they may be ashamed, they may not know they've been scammed, or they're concerned that their relatives will think that they've lost their mental capacity to manage their own financial affairs. So you can see where that would be a real issue, that if I report, then my family's going to jump in here and think that this is a sign that I've lost my capacity. So that's a big issue. Seniors, when we talked about being more polite, and which makes it hard to say no, especially some of the products that promise to cure or slow aging problems and diseases, they're more vulnerable because of the inability to say no to those kind of things as well. Okay, so let's talk about signs of abuse so we can all be aware if there's an issue going on. So when we look at the signs of abuse and think about how do we know if either a client of ours or a family member of ours is falling victim to any of these crimes. So this is according to the National Committee for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, that you should look for several indicators that some abuse has occurred. And you see this list on your screen, but the unpaid bills, eviction notice, notice to discontinue utilities could be a sign. Any unusual activity in bank accounts, large withdrawals, frequent transfers, ATM withdrawals. So the folks I know who recently were robbed by their son when he was caring for them, after the one person died in the couple, they were able to see that there had been ATM withdrawal after ATM withdrawal. Every time he went out to the grocery store, he would take the ATM card and then end up taking additional money for himself without them being aware of it. So those kind of things are some of the patterns that people start to see, but if you're not watching for it, it can be a problem. Missing bank statements, obviously somebody trying to hide it. New best friends, people who just show up and suddenly are very attached to this older person, can be a sign that there's a problem going on. New legal documents or financial arrangements that the older adult says they're unaware of can be a problem. There is an issue that I know going on right now that friends have told me about in Toronto, Canada, where older adults are being told that they need new hot water heaters that they don't need, and companies are coming in and taking out the old hot water heaters, putting in the new hot water heaters, and creating a situation where the older adult has either a new bill or a more expensive bill than they expected because of the addition of the new hot water heater. And when they're asked about it, the older adult thought that that was a required service they had to get because of the way it was presented to them. So belongings or property that are missing on a regular basis, if the person doesn't have dementia and isn't misplacing them, maybe that somebody truly is stealing from them. Suspicious signatures on checks. So if you're looking at a signature and you're thinking, that doesn't really look like my parent's signature, or the client is saying, that doesn't really look like my signature, it's something that we need to look at. And then obviously any implausible explanation about the older adult's finances, either by the person himself or a family member, a caregiver, a friend, all of those things need to be considered. I think the thing we need to recognize is that one of these factors alone doesn't necessarily indicate financial abuse. It's really seeing a pattern of things going on, or over time seeing it happen, that then we start looking at seeing, okay, is there a problem here or not? And one of the issues is that some of these things happen simply in a legitimate sense. So I do an Ask Dr. Amy column for Home Instead Senior Care, and one of my recent questions somebody sent in was about a caregiver who truly befriended the dad, and she was incredibly suspicious. And it might have been a situation of abuse, but in the telling of it, it also sounded like this person really, truly had come into the picture and cared about the dad and wasn't trying to take his money. And I think those are always hard things to distinguish. You have to look for, is there something going on? But also know that many times there isn't. And how do you sort that out is the hard part. So let's talk about that. How do you help prevent this, and how do you keep on top of these things? Let's talk about how to help prevent the fraud. According to the National Council on Aging, there are 8 steps that can help older adults avoid being scammed. And I really want to encourage you to pass this information along. The first thing you see on the screen is we need to help older adults understand that they need to be aware that they're at risk for these kind of scams, both by strangers, but also by people closest to them. And I think that's the hardest part for people to accept, that people who love them could treat them this way. And I think as professionals, we can talk to people about the fact that it has nothing to do with how the person feels about them. It truly may be a desperate situation that's putting them in that position. Second thing is we can encourage older adults to avoid being isolated, because isolation is a big issue. So doesn't mean the person has to live with someone, but staying involved with family and friends, staying involved if they're part of a religious organization or social activities, all of those things that keep people engaged and prevent isolation really help them to not be victims of a crime. The third thing you see there is that we suggest to older adults that they don't tell solicitors on the phone that the information about, whether it's credit cards or Social Security or any of those things, that they ask for everything in writing and that they ask to see every offer in writing. As you and I know, if an offer is legitimate, it can be put in writing. So requesting that and requiring that is important. And then the fourth thing you see there is encouraging older adults to shred all documents that have either their credit card or their Social Security number or financial account numbers on them. This is really key. We should encourage people to not have those things sitting around, and certainly not to just throw them away. That's an issue. Okay, so now let's talk about, on the next screen, we'll look at the 4 more of these things that we can do to help prevent fraud. So you see there, sign up for the Do Not Call list. This can really help people to get off the calling that they don't want for all of these potential problems. So signing up for Do Not Call doesn't solve every problem, but it can help. Signing up for direct deposit for benefits checks obviously helps keep things from being stolen from mailboxes, which can be a big issue. And then never giving out, again, the credit card, banking, Social Security information, making sure that you can call back a number. A lot of times people are taken by the fact that someone pretends to be their bank, and so they give the information. So making sure that they call back the bank and check things out before they give it out is important. And telling older adults to really be skeptical of any unsolicited offer and really do take their time to be an informed consumer. And obviously, you see there the local Elder Protective Service office is a great place to call if you assume that something may have happened that needs to be reported. Okay, let's talk more about who you can call. So you can also call the local law enforcement agency. So call the police, call someone, and talk about this scam. You can give anonymous tips and file complaints at FBI.gov. And then there's a fabulous kit that you might want to take a look at, which is Home Instead Senior Care's Protect Seniors from Fraud video series and the Fraud Protection Kit. And those can both be found, you see there, at caregiverstress.com. So more information, very practical ways to deal with this are listed there. Let's take a look at some resources before we open up the phone lines. So where do you go to get some of these resources? Well, obviously the FBI is a place you can go. Their website is excellent for these things. We mentioned the Home Instead Senior Care Kit. And there specifically is the FBI Gov Scam Safety Fraud. And the National Committee for the Prevention of Elder Abuse has fabulous resources. So take a look at that. National Council on Aging also has great resources. And that life study of elder financial abuse, the one that I've been referring to, you can go to that website and download the report and all of the findings, which really were in some ways shocking, in other ways not shocking, but certainly very helpful to start being more aware of the kind of scams that many of our clients are subject to, as well as many of our family members. Okay, so where do you go from here? I think talking about the next steps, we can talk about being aware of specific strategies that you can share with older adults and their caregivers, and we've talked about some of those today. And also, as a professional, being aware of what you need to be on the lookout for as you're working with older adults, listening to the stories, listening to things that may be happening in their lives, and also making their caregivers aware of these. And then the tips that you can share with both the families and the older adults. All of these are key if we're going to help reverse this trend of the number of scams going up and start protecting vulnerable people in our society better. Obviously, this isn't just older adults, but it is older adults who are vulnerable specifically, as well as other groups who are vulnerable to these sort of situations. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to turn it back to Steve, who's going to open up so that we can do some questions and answers now. Steve?
All right, thanks for a great presentation, Amy.
You're welcome. This is a hard one because it's not an easy topic, to talk about these things.
Definitely not, but we are glad that we're doing so today, and there's been a lot of great information, and we're getting a lot of great questions, and as well as suggestions in from the attendees, which we're going to try to hit as many as we can. Also want to welcome to the line Mary Alexander from Home Instead Senior Care, who's going to be helping out with the Q&A. So welcome, Mary.
Hi, Steve. Thank you.
Okay, so let's jump right into it. Right here. The first question, I frequently talk with a senior about not responding to telephone solicitors. Your point about requesting everything in writing is well taken, but how do we convince the senior to say this?
Convince the senior to ask for everything in writing? Mary, sounds like you'd like to answer that one.
Yeah, this happens a lot, and I think the important piece to remember as we try to solve for this problem is the seniors especially that are living alone and don't have much company, really look forward to that phone to ring, right? So they a lot of times give extra time and thought to who's on the other line and what they're asking for. It becomes kind of a companionship element in their day, and they look forward to it. So yes, we very much recommend that everything is in writing before they decide to make a donation or assist someone, because 9 times out of 10, the person on the other end of the call, the other end of the line, doesn't have anything. But the important part to remember is that is a socialization piece for the senior who's living alone, and so there's a key element for them. They want companionship. They want to talk to someone. even if the other person on the end of the phone is asking for something from them. So there's two issues that have to be solved here. Making sure the senior is socialized and has people to talk to and connect to, whether it be on the phone, on the internet, family members that come over, church members, and then making sure that they always ask for the same pieces of information when asked for a donation, which is always in writing, always through the mail.
Okay, and we've got a lot of great comments and suggestions coming in, as I mentioned, and I do want to share a couple of these really quick. First one, suggest they tell the solicitors that they will have their attorney review the agreement. That's
a great one.
That's very good. Next one here, the Attorney General's website also has a list of legitimate charities if someone wants to check that out there. So the Attorney General's website, go on there and take a look, and they will have the list of legitimate charities in case you get a solicitation for one of them. Another comment here, you should also report any potential scam to the local area agency on aging. The AAAs are also a very good resource for help.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, great suggestions coming in here. Go back to the questions here, and I think this is a really good one. How can we better help an older adult realize that they are the victim of a scam when they think that they are not?
You know, that one's really tough because there's two sides to this, right? The actually what has happened, and then the seniors not wanting to admit that maybe they were scammed. This does happen more than you think. The senior doesn't tell anybody, right, because they don't want anyone to know. They don't want to think that they can't handle their own affairs, or that someone scammed them, or that they trusted someone and they shouldn't have. So there's a stigma attached to that, and that's something that really needs to be handled very delicately. So, we've had some additional questions on our Caregiver Stress website with the fraud kit, and it really went down the path of, I know my mom was scammed out of some money from a contractor, but she won't admit to it. Well, it's approach. It's having an open dialogue to say, Mom, you know what? I'm not sure the contractor did the best job possible, and I'm not sure what you paid him, but I think for the safety of us and the safety of others, we probably need to look into this. That's a very different conversation than saying, I think this guy ripped you off, and we need to do something about it. So I think it's about the approach and the conversation that you have, not pointing fingers, not blaming them, but just being really honest about, Mom, something about this doesn't feel right to me. I don't ever want to get scammed by him. Would you recommend that he work for me on a project, or your next door neighbor, or should we look into this a little bit? So again, all about the approach. Dr. Amy?
Yeah, I'm sitting here, Mary, thinking how great it is you're saying that, because there's so much shame and embarrassment that goes along with this problem. And I think we have to recognize that, people, when they're older and feeling vulnerable in many ways, the last thing they want to do is be embarrassed by this kind of thing and feel that it's a sign to their family that they're no longer in control of their lives. So I love, Mary, that you talked about having a sensitive approach to this and not adding to people's embarrassment, because if you approach them in the way that is going to add to the embarrassment, you're less likely to get accurate information, and you're actually adding to the problem to some degree, by piling on embarrassment or shame. And I think sometimes it's our own fear that makes us do those kind of things and talk in those ways, so we have to be careful about that. So I thought that was great, Mary. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, a couple other resources to share here. Another resource for seniors and family caregivers is the National Senior Medicare Patrol Program by the Administration on Aging. Again, that's the National Senior Medicare Patrol Program by the Administration on Aging. They are located in every state, and they provide education to seniors about Medicare, health care, fraud, and abuse. So again, that's the National Senior Medicare Patrol Program by the Administration on Aging. Also, another tip here, there was just a story on this attendee's local news in the past week where the number of the police department was showing up on people's cell phone caller ID, and as you can imagine, it was not the police who were making the phone call in question. So the possibility of endless schemes is really pretty endless, but did want to put that one out there as well. Another
Wow.
tip, healthcare fraud, there's a program called SMP, Senior Medicare Patrol, and that's in every state. Okay, so let's get back to the questions here. This is a good one. How do you feel about seniors using online banking or online credit card accounts to check transactions? Is that safe?
Mary, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, there's not an answer to say yes or no. I mean, I think there's a lot of other things that go into that. Is online banking safe? Yes, if you do it appropriately, right? If you have a network that's locked down, right? If you follow the protocols of your bank, if you are diligent about checking it. So yes, I use online banking. I do online banking for my father, who can no longer do it. But I am very careful about the protections, about the strength of my passwords, about making sure I change that often, and I review it often. If it's something that you're sharing a shared computer, those kinds of things are, I would say, no. So it really depends on the environment in which you're doing it. But again, there's no specific answer because that question's pretty broad. But if you can do it safely with the appropriate protocols in place.
Okay. Next question. I found out there was a case of financial theft when I talked to a senior about the problem. He begged that I did not report the person. The amount was substantial. What recourse do I have if this older adult refuses to file charges or at best even report the theft?
I think that there's a couple different ways you can go. First of all, at Home Instead Senior Care, we require that any abuse or fraud gets reported to the police department regardless. Now, it is the client's decision, right, or the senior's decision if they choose to do anything about it. But I would tell you, I think as people caring for seniors in any setting, that we need to take the protective step to report any abuse or fraud.
All right. Next question here. I recently had a client state to me that while she was in the hospital for a few months, her daughters came into her home, quote unquote, to clean, and they removed some items such as paintings, vintage dishes and tea set, and a grandfather clock. She wanted the items back, but the daughters claimed that she didn't need those items and they were clearing out clutter and that they had donated them to thrift stores. Is removal of household items not considered potential elder abuse?
I mean, in my view, it is. I'll be interested to hear what Mary has to say about this, but I think this is often the way families do things that are taking things from older adults, and that's a perfect example. If that woman didn't want those out of her house, that's her decision to make, and no one has a right any more than they have a right to come into our houses and do that, to make a decision that she no longer needs those things. You know, it's tricky because it's family, and we never know the history of how all these things have gone. But I see that if the person says they did not want that to happen, then to me that is abuse. Mary, what's your view on that?
Yeah, you can look at it two ways. It's interesting that they're even questioning the fact is this abuse. Yes, I mean, this is theft. It might have been theft right out from under her nose, right? It's easier to look at theft when you don't know the person, right? When it's someone that you don't know that's done this to you. When it's a family member, it's so much harder to say you stole from me. But in reality, if someone took something against your knowledge, against your will, against your desire, then yeah, it's theft. And I probably would, if this were my parents, I would say to them, give them 3 days to bring it back. Otherwise, you'll be calling the police and creating a police report. Because, again, this is about, if your family member is doing this or if family members are doing this, then they're not going to stop at some paintings or a clock. It's going to continue. And I think that, these are your things. And although very hard to do that to a family member, they need to be stopped. So.
Okay, a couple more really useful tips here. One attendee writes in, TV specials seem to be a problem with specific seniors. My advice is to always tell them, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true, and that seems to get the point across. Second remark here, you need to bring out the potential dangers involved in an older adult giving general powers of attorney to a family member or friend. That's got to be ripe with abuse right there. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
My thought is just that people do need to be very careful about that, as well as putting people on jointly on bank accounts. Those things can make people vulnerable, and they need to talk to their lawyer when they do a power of attorney about how they want the limits to be on that.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, we're starting to see some pretty innovative things in that space. So, for example, a friend of mine whose mother was going in to have major surgery, she has 4 children, and all very, great professional jobs, but all kind of have their own lives. She ended up doing a power of attorney, and it's a dual sign-off. So 2 of her children are on this. So if any extraordinary measures have to be taken or whatever, both have to agree. And if they don't agree, it goes into the third child. So I think there's some innovative things happening in this space. I don't know that it's recognized by every state. So I would say that you have to figure out what works best for you and find a solution to that.
Okay, next question. What about a situation where a client has withdrawn because they have been a victim? How do you get them back involved with activities that they enjoyed previously?
Yeah, it's not just about getting them back involved. It's getting them to trust again. I mean, I think it goes more than just getting them out of the house and getting them to not. I mean, there's part depression that can come with this. There's trust issues that come with this. It's really it affects their entire emotional being because they've been scammed. They're fearful. They've been shamed. They're probably now in sometimes a financial hardship. So there's more than just getting them back out to play bridge. I mean, this is really about getting them to understand how and what happened, how it won't happen again, and kind of get them back on their feet so they can take some control back of in their life. At that point, then they're probably more willing to go out and be social again and to do some of those things. And I'll tell you, sometimes that takes the help of a professional.
That's right. And I think that's so well said, Mary. I like that you talked about, and it's about not just trusting other people. It really is about losing trust in themselves to make good decisions. Mm-hmm. That's often the issue.
All right, and then another comment here. Participation at senior centers reduces senior isolation, as well as giving the senior an objective person to see their mail or examine fraudulent offers. So that's another good tip that we wanted to pass along to you. Well, as you know, this is a mammoth problem, and unfortunately we're out of time today. It is just about time for us to wrap up today's web seminar. But I want to thank Dr. Amy Dupree and Mary Alexander from Home Instead Senior Care for joining us for a fantastic and very informative presentation. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve.